I first met Bruce Beyer. I did not know Bruce Beyer in 1977. Is that right? In 1977, but I did go to Buffalo with some friends who I coerced into going, who were all veterans. I put them in, I think, somebody's car, 2 cars, and we went to Buffalo and walked across the Peace Bridge into Canada and brought Bruce Beyer back home to America. At the time, I didn't know Bruce Beyer. I didn't know some of the people who were with him, but we did get to be friends, I would call it, in the months that followed. And then eventually he was, I think you told me last night again about the felony conviction, which I want you to mention tonight today. But so eventually I brought him into my class at Attica at the time. The inmates really liked that because they knew he was going to be incarcerated. So I had an immediate kinship with Mr. Beyer at the time, because here he is going to go into jail, and those guys were in jail, as they would say, or in prison. So we got to be good friends over a long period of time, and say a year or so before he was finally, or half a year before he was finally put in jail. And it's really great to have him kind of as our last person in this program. We've had a Vietnam combat nurse, we had an American novelist and short story writer, David Means. We had a short talk by myself and the director of the Spring Valley NAACP at the Nyack Library last week, and at last we're having Bruce Beyer, who's going to tell us about what it's like to resist fighting in a war and the consequences you pay for that resistance. Bruce Beyer.
Thank you. Do you mind if I stand over here? Will that screw up your shot? Because I don't like standing at the end of the room. I don't get an opportunity to speak to young people, with young people very often, so I have a couple of questions that I wanted to start out with. To the men, how many of you are between the ages of 18 and 26? And how many of you registered with Selective Service? None of you? Any of you got, oh, you did, and you did. The rest of you did not. I guess we have some draft resistors in the room, because by law you're required to register with Selective Service. And it comes with a 5-year prison sentence and a $250,000 fine if you did not register with Selective Service when you turned 18 years of age.
I just want to ask, wasn't it like you don't technically have to do, but they kind of like hamper you so much until you do it? Like, you're not going to penalize you for anything, but you can't, like, if you don't.
Well, the way they penalize, that's a good question. The way they penalize you is by denying you access to federal funding for school aid. That's one of the ways they compel you.
Yeah.
If a man fails to register or provide Selective Service with evidence that he is exempt from registration requirement after receiving Selective Service reminder and/or compliance mailings, his name is referred to the Department of Justice for possible investigation and prosecution for his failure to register. So you are in non-compliance, and you are in non-compliance, and you are in non-compliance. So welcome to my club. Thank you. How many of you have ever seen an order to report for induction? Or do you know what an order to report for induction is? Okay, well, in the 60s, the Selective Service system ordered young men into the military through a process called inducting. And they issued people an order to report for induction. So I thought I'd bring a copy of it with me to show you all. You're welcome to keep a copy of it. My warning to you is that given the circumstances that exist in this country right now, I suspect sometime in the not too distant future, your registration with Selective Service is going to come to bear on your lives or the lives of your friends, because I don't believe that our present administration is going to be able to continue fighting simply drone wars in the Middle East. Eventually it's going to involve soldiers' feet on the ground, boots on the ground, so to speak. But I wanted to read to you, in 1965, the head of the Selective Service system was a guy named General Lewis Hershey. He was a World War II vet, and he wrote a document explaining the philosophy behind why selective service exists in this country and why they use it in the United States as a method of bringing men into and women into military service. Obviously now things have changed and women are involved in volunteering in the so-called volunteer army. In those days, it was force compliance. But in developing the philosophy behind selective service, this is what he wrote. The psychology of granting wide choice under pressure to take action is the American or indirect way of achieving what is done by direction in foreign countries where choice is not permitted. Here, choice is limited but not denied, and it is fundamental that an individual generally applies himself better to something he has decided to do rather than something he's been forced to do. And through a system of deferments, the selective service was set up so that if you were a student, you got a deferment and were able to continue in your education. If you were a tool and die maker, if you had a skill that was in the national interest, you were allowed to continue in that endeavor. But if you were a bum on the street or you were a failure in college, then the club of induction was used to force you to make the choice of going into the military. When I read this document in 1966, I was 18 years old. And the thought that the government was channeling the direction of choices that I was going to be forced to make, I found absolutely abhorrent. And I coupled that with a very limited understanding of what was going on in Southeast Asia. I was 18, I didn't even know where Vietnam was for that. I mean, I did, but it was out there somewhere. But I had a moral objection to killing. I did not want to participate in shooting somebody, killing somebody. No Vietnamese ever attacked me on the street. No Vietnamese ever flew an airplane into my buildings. No Vietnamese person ever threatened me. I did not in any way, shape, or form feel threatened by the Vietnamese people, the existence of Vietnam, the country of Vietnam, which, when you think about it, was a very agrarian society, a peasant society, that had been going on, fighting a war of independence against the French, the Chinese, for decades and centuries, actually, against the Chinese. So I made an application for what was called conscientious objector status. Does anybody know what a CO status is? Do you know what that is? Okay, well, a conscientious objector is someone who is opposed to killing. So I made an application to my draft board and asked them to pronounce me a conscientious objector. Well, I was turned down. And the reason I was turned down was because the question came up, would you have fought in World War II? And that was a difficult question for me because I felt at the time that perhaps I would have fought in World War II. We were under attack by the Nazis. It was a war that to some degree or another I'd probably have supported, and I would have fought in that war. That made me ineligible to be a conscientious objector, and I was denied CO status. So there I was. I objected to selective service, and I objected to the war in Vietnam. I didn't know what I was going to do. I was 18 years old. I was in college. The following year, after having miserably failed out of college, I'm working in a motel on the east side of Buffalo, the ghetto area of Buffalo, as a night clerk. I knew the draft was coming after me. I knew they were going to induct me into the military. And I was faced with a decision of what I was going to do. So I met a young woman who was involved in anti-war activity, and she asked me, what are you doing? Well, at that point I had enlisted in the Air Force, and I was enlisted on a delayed entry program. And I was going to go in the Air Force because I was told by the recruiter that if I joined the Air Force, I wouldn't probably have to serve in combat. And that's what I was trying to avoid. because I didn't believe in killing. But she said to me, well, have you ever given any consideration to the fact that you could simply say no? And it was a concept that was so foreign to me. But it honestly, it just grabbed my heart. And I went down to Washington, D.C. on October 1967, and I turned my draft card in. Everybody at my age is required to have a draft card. I went to the Justice Department and I turned my draft card in along with 983 other guys who turned their cards in that day. And the cards were carried into the Justice Department and given to then United States Attorney General Ramsey Clark. And he was Lyndon Johnson's Attorney General. And I thought, well, as soon as I did that, I'd be arrested, but I wasn't. I went home, back to Buffalo, New York. I received in the subsequent 3 or 4 months. Is this for me, this water?
Yes, it is.
Oh, thank you.
Enjoy it.
3 orders telling me to report for induction. And on each occasion, I refused. First time I went into the recruiting, the induction center and stood up, and when they said step forward, I stepped back. The second time I burned my induction order. And the third time I was in Boston, and I turned my induction orders into Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky at a demonstration at the Boston Common. It was a huge demonstration. And then I got a 4th order to report for induction. Excuse me. And I wanted to bring it to a head. I wanted to force a confrontation with our government, my government. And I took symbolic sanctuary in my family church, the Unitarian Church of Buffalo, New York. Go ahead.
Well, you know, my father, he did sign up for selective service, but he was almost drafted into the war. He was like this close. And
right.
Actually, to be honest, I mean, I did actually apply for selective service. I mean, I just couldn't remember, but I think I just remembered now thanks to you, because I do remember signing a form for like college, and I did apply for selective service, so I'm good.
You're withdrawing from being a draft resistor.
I mean, I know there's
not.
I know there's cool. Not like a major war like World War II or World War III, but I know we have to be ready, you know.
Well, that's what they tell us. Yes. Let me finish my story.
Okay.
So I took symbolic sanctuary in the church in Buffalo, my family's church. And what I was trying to do in taking the sanctuary in the church was force a confrontation with the government. And I was in the church for 11 days. And it was headlines in the Buffalo newspapers and actually across the country. And what I was doing was using the sanctuary as a way to, I knew I could be arrested in the church. I wasn't trying to hide. I was there in plain sight. It was a way to force the government's hand. And the 11th day, 32 FBI agents, federal marshals, backed up by 100 local police, stormed the doors of the church, and I was arrested. And in the process of effecting their arrest, a fight broke out, and I fought back against the FBI agents and the federal marshals and the Buffalo police, and was dragged out of the church and charged with forcibly impeding, opposing, resisting, assaulting FBI agents in the process of carrying out official duties. I faced a 5-year prison sentence for that and a $10,000 fine. And for refusing induction, I faced 5 years and another $10,000 fine. But I used the event, the arrest, as a way to talk about the war. And I was absolutely morally opposed to the war, and I am morally opposed to the selective service system. As time went on, from August of 1968 until I was put on trial, my politics changed. And I went from being what I would consider a nonviolent a political activist to a revolutionary. And my eyes were open to racism, my eyes were open to sexism, my eyes were open to militarism, and the more I learned, the angrier I got. And when I finally went on trial in 1969, I was a pretty angry young man. I was pissed about what our government was doing, both in Vietnam and the ghettos of the United States, and what they had done to myself and my 8 other co-defendants. There were 8 of us arrested in the church that day. And of the 8 arrested, 4 were veterans. One was a World War II veteran, Bill Yates, who had enlisted at the age of 16 in World War II in the Navy and had fought in Okinawa. 3 others were Vietnam veterans. One, Ray Malik, was an Air Force veteran, and the 2 others, Jim McGlynn and Tom O'Connell, were both Army veterans. So here was a strange dichotomy. A draft resistor taking symbolic sanctuary in a church being arrested along with 4 veterans. One of whom, Ray Malik, had just returned from Vietnam and stood with us because what he had learned as an Air Force interpreter in Vietnam so horrified him that he came out to support us and was swept up in the arrest. I was convicted in the federal district court, sentenced to 5 years for refusing induction. And within a few months, I was as I told you, my politics had changed. I gave a speech at the University of Buffalo against I was not a student there. I gave a speech about ROTC, Reserve Officers Training Corps, which was the military's way of training officers for use in Vietnam. And I saw its presence on university campuses as being antithetical to what I believe a university is, obviously an institution of higher learning. After the speech, students went out and destroyed the ROTC building, and I was charged with inciting a riot, burglary, arson, conspiracy to commit riot. I was facing about 30 years in prison, on top of the 5 years that I'd already been sentenced to for refusing induction, and 3 years for assaulting federal marshals. I was out on bail, $10,000 bail that my father had posted. My father was a Republican, president of the local Rotary Club. I grew up white middle class. I had everything going for me except that I wasn't a good student and I wasn't focused. But I had a brain, and I knew what was going on in Vietnam, and I knew what was going on in the black communities across the country was wrong. I jumped bail, and I went to Sweden. And I lived underground in Montreal for 6 months while I tried to get a false Canadian passport, which I finally did, through a very circuitous route, actually using the same technique that James Earl Ray used to get a false Canadian passport after he killed Martin Luther King, and he went to Canada and got a false passport and went to London. I got a false Canadian passport and went to Sweden. I was granted humanitarian asylum by the Swedish people, the Swedish government. I lived there for 2 years. It was a very interesting place to be. There were never more than 650 Vietnam-era deserters and draft resistors living in Sweden, primarily deserters, and they were in Sweden via the route of Germany. And they'd been in the military, many of them, most of them, had been in the military, and because of their behavior in the military, their opposition to the war, what have you, for disciplinary reasons, they went to Sweden because obviously it was nearby. I mean, it was easy to get to. I lived in Sweden for 2 years, and then married a Canadian woman, and because of that was able to immigrate to Canada. And I moved to Canada in 1972. I lived there for the next 5 years until 1977. In 1976, I read a book by a woman named Gloria Emerson called Winners and Losers. And that book changed my life because it forced me to come to the realization that in order for me to bring my story to some reasonable conclusion, I needed to go back to the States and go to jail. So on October 20th, 1977, as Jerry mentioned, I walked across the Peace Bridge and surrendered to US authorities. But interestingly enough, this time 2 things happened. One, 50 Vietnam veterans walked with me, Jerry being one of them, and the former United States Attorney General Ramsey Clark was my attorney. And this is the man I turned my draft card into in 1967. And also, as I crossed the bridge, I was holding hands with Colonel Edison W. Miller, who was the highest ranking Marine Corps POW, who'd spent 5.5 years in a POW camp in Hanoi. And a significant cross-section of America, the former United States Attorney General, a POW, 50 Vietnam vets, and a draft resistor. There has always been, since that time, this myth that Vietnam veterans and draft resistors, anti-war protesters, did not support each other, did not function together. And to a certain extent, there are a lot of conservative, right-wing, I'll go for that far, Vietnam vets and older vets who opposed what I did. But there also were literally millions of Vietnam vets who supported what I did and who, in fact, in hindsight, wish they'd done what I've done. This one being one of them. I went to jail. Again, it's very curious, you know. I came back to the States. I fully expected to be incarcerated right away. I went before the federal district court judge, a guy named John Curtin, and he looked at me, he looked at the former United States Attorney General, he looked at the U.S. District Attorney, he said, come on into my offices. And we go into his offices, and he turns to me and he says, Mr. Beyer, I was appointed to the bench under Lyndon Johnson by Ramsey Clark. And he turns to the U.S. Attorney and he said, in the course of the past 10 years since Mr. Beyer jumped bail and fled the country, I've had a change of heart about the Vietnam War. I'm going to let this man go home. And that night I went home after 10 years of living in exile. It was not what I expected. In fact, it totally blew my mind. So he withheld judgment on whether he would impose sentence for a year. At the end of the year, he decided to send me to jail for 30 days. And I went to jail for 30 days. So I said to myself, well, that's it. That's the end. I'm done. 3 years later, President Jimmy Carter was elected 2 years later, and he announced the reinstitution of selective service registration. And I was living in Western Massachusetts at that point because as a federal felon living in Buffalo with my name in the paper all the time for over a 10-year period, I was unable to find work. Nobody would hire me. I was working in social services. It just was impossible to find work. I moved to Western Massachusetts because it was a little more friendly country. But because when Jimmy Carter reinstituted selective service, a group of friends and I went down to the U.S. Post Office, in those days where you were supposed to register. We sat down in front of the post office and said, we aren't going to allow registration to go forward. Well, I'm sorry to say we failed you, but I was arrested. I was charged with, once again, impeding official government process, hauled off to jail. There was a federal trial. In Western Massachusetts, a pretty liberal area. I was cut loose with I think a $100 fine. It was really surprising again. I stayed in Western Massachusetts, was very active in anti-nuclear power activities with the Seabrook demonstrations. I was arrested there. I've spent the last 50 years of my life in opposition to US military, domestic and foreign policy. I haven't won. I don't feel hopeless. I worry about your futures, the futures of your kids. The present situation with our president threatening war against spin the wheel, who knows who he's going to go to war with, whether it's North Korea, whether it's in the Middle East. His recent moves to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel is just an atrocious decision that's going to result in, I mean, it just began today. It's going to explode. The Middle East is going to explode. The people of Palestine will not tolerate Jerusalem being declared the capital of Israel. Let's see, what else can I tell you about myself? The time in Sweden was interesting. Time in Canada was very much involved in what was called the Amnesty Movement, which was a movement to declare a pardon war resistors. The country had come to a decision about war resistors that said, well, maybe we just need to pardon them all. But the curious thing was that the demand for amnesty was primarily focused on Vietnam veterans. There were over 750,000 less than honorable discharges passed out by the military during the Vietnam War for so-called crimes that would not be considered crimes in civilian life.
Yeah, so let's point that out on this chart, though. Look at your little. You look on the left-hand side. There's a little like served in combat, and then served in non-combat, and then you kind of go down. What Bruce is talking about, less than honorable discharges, over 500,000, 563,000 people were given less than honorable discharges. You know, look at the wounded and look at the killed. These statistics have changed a little bit, they've gone up. But you can see that a lot of people got bad discharges as well, and administratively discharged besides that, or court-martialed. So it's interesting, like if you look what he's saying, deferred, exempted, disqualified, 15 million people were deferred service. And if there's other charts in this book saying if you were higher income, you were more likely to be able, 40% of the combat troops in that war were from lower income families. So you were more likely, to, if you were a lower income, to get combat and also not get a deferment.
Well, it makes sense. The government's getting money from the rich people, actual people from the poor people.
Right. So you can see the other charts, but if you're interested, it's in a little book. It's an old book now, but so the statistics have only gone up. They haven't gone down. What they've been able to do is get you more, you know, what happened to the wounded, et cetera, et cetera. And they don't have very good statistics about suicide on this one, but I think in some of my classes we've got, a couple of my classes we've done some work on that in my English 102 class, so there's a couple of people here now. We actually
well, more Vietnam veterans committed suicide than died during the Vietnam War.
No, yeah, isn't that true that they also have like a higher percentage to kill themselves too than like other veterans, like of other wars?
Well, the suicide rate among Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans is extremely high.
Yeah, it's 18 a day.
So it hasn't worked itself out yet. You know, one of the issues with Vietnam vets was Agent Orange, post-traumatic stress, obviously. In Iraq, it's been guys, both PTSD and their exposure to chemicals in dumps that were burned and also depleted uranium. So 750,000 Vietnam vets with bad paper, which basically puts them in the same category that I was in. A federal felony conviction, one of the reasons the military passed out bad paper was it gave them the ability to refuse medical treatment. It gave them the ability to refuse financial aid for school. So they saved themselves enormous amounts of money by passing out bad paper. Anyway, when I came back to the States, I was still out on bail. Actually, I was released on my own recognizance. And the attorney representing me, Ramsey Clark, had expenses. Obviously, he was defending me in federal court. So I went on a speaking tour across the country to raise money to pay for the lawyer. And there were 2 books I carried with me. I hope that all of you have read this book. Have you? If you haven't, you should read this book because it is the most powerful anti-war, anti-Vietnam War poetry that I've ever read in my life. And I used to go around to students and I would open it up, and no matter where I read from, there was a glimpse of the war as Jerry experienced it. And I would say, you gotta read this, because if you don't understand this book, you won't know what's coming for you if in the event of war. And I believe that this book, written in 1977 or published in 77, is as prescient as it was then as it is today. And I thought it was fascinating that in this brochure about this event, both the art and the speakers that have been here, that Jerry refers to a quote from this book from Ernest Hemingway, in which Hemingway talks about the war might be over, but how does it go, Jerry? In the fall, the war was always there, but we did not go to it anymore. And you know, it's true. For Vietnam vets, for me, as well as Vietnam vets, the Vietnam War is still inside my head. And recently, the Burns and Novick documentaries regarding Vietnam bounced me right off the wall, because even though I didn't serve in Vietnam, I remember I literally remember every day, every event, every murder, every My Lai, every bombing of Haiphong, and the documentary by Burns and Novick brought that all back to me. The other book I carried with me was this book by my friend John Marciano called Teaching the Vietnam War. And in this book, Marciano predicts that unless the history of Vietnam, the history of the Vietnam War, is taught in high schools and on college campuses, we're bound to repeat the mistakes of what Vietnam was. And by God, if you don't look at Korea and draw associations, Korea right now, and draw associations between what's going on, what Trump is doing in terms of his threats to Korea, and what Johnson and Nixon and all of the former presidents did in relation to Vietnam, you're missing it. You're really missing it, because 31,000 American soldiers died in the Korean War. 2 million Koreans were killed. We repeated the mistakes 10 years later in Vietnam. 58,000 American soldiers died. 3 million Vietnamese people were killed. And what did we get? Nothing. We end up in the same place that we were before. And the same thing is going to happen into Korea, except that in Korea now, with this madman in the White House, it could very well be nuclear war. And there are no winners in nuclear war. There are only losers in nuclear war. And so I end by predicting nothing but dire consequences if young people, from Me Too to Black Lives Matter to the anti-war movement, don't start going into the streets and don't start demanding an end to this nonsense, because you're all under threat. So thank you, and thank you for listening to me. So I'm here to answer questions. got questions, I'm happy. Go ahead.
So, well, I know you talked a little bit about what made you finally be like, okay, I have to go back to the States. I just wanted you to maybe expand on that, you know, like what about that book really made you be like, you know, like I have to face music?
Well, I was living in a small town in northern Ontario. It was about 120 miles north of Toronto, a place called Bancroft. I owned a 150-acre piece of land. Land was cheap up in northern Ontario in those days. I didn't have a lot of money. I was pretty comfortable. I was happy. I was back to the land. Had a little garden. Feeding myself, smoking pot, and reading. When I read Gloria's book, what it did to me was it forced me to realize that I was hiding. It forced me to come to grips with I needed to force another confrontation. I needed to go back there and say, fuck you, you're not going to do this to me. At the time, the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, was saying, we've got to put the war behind us. And my feeling was, you can't kill 3 million people and simply walk away from it and say, well, put it behind us. You can't lose 60,000 young American lives and say, put it behind you. So my feeling was that I go back to the States, at least in my own mind, at least, you know, because obviously I'm a legend in my own mind, I'll be able to look at myself at the age of 70, which I am now, and be proud of what I did. And I am proud of what I did. I did the right thing. And that book helped me find my way home, quite honestly.
We'll talk about home in class.
Yeah, you know, the book he's speaking of was called Winners and Losers, who won the National Book Award. And I would have to say, the book had changed my life as well. I mean, I have to say, reading her book, finally meeting her, really had something to do. Once you read, because it was a very different kind of book. I mean, well, it was written in a way that I think it's accessible. You could turn it to any page and you could find something that you could connect with, whether it was the Vietnamese or American boys or fathers and mothers from towns where boys had been killed, young men had been killed. But just the way the book grabbed you in a personal way. I have a small video of Gloria reading here. She was one of the first people I brought in because she was at Princeton then, so I brought her out myself. I drove her down and brought her in just so people could meet her. And then she spoke. We have a tape. All I only have is a audio tape. I don't have the visuals of her talking, but I think what she was trying to say then, which was in the 80s, was still resonating. So I don't think if we don't even have a memory of that, of saying like you sat in at a post office, I sat in someplace when that draft came up because we were very concerned that you were going to have to do what you have to do now. Like you had to sign this paper in order to get, as my sons did when they went to college, they had to sign up for the.
Mine too.
That's ridiculous. You have to sign your life away to get education.
Right.
To get your, if you wanted a student loan or you wanted what called FAFSA or whatever the financial aid was. Yeah.
The other part of your answer to your question, my parents were getting older. I was living in Canada. They lived in Buffalo, so we were pretty close. In fact, one time there was a nightly television show called The Tomorrow Show by a guy named Tom Snyder. It was, you know, it's like it wasn't Jay Leno, but it was a little slightly more serious. But there was, well, during the Amnesty Movement, they flew my parents out to Hollywood and they flew me out to Vancouver, and they put us on a split screen talking about amnesty. Well, my parents lived in Buffalo and I lived in Toronto, which was 90 miles away. By the time they flew us out there, we were hundreds of miles away. We did this show on amnesty. But I realized during that show that my parents were getting older. And my father was talking about buying a burial plot in Fort Erie, Ontario, so that I wouldn't come back to the States to attend his funeral. One of the ways the FBI chased down draft resistors and deserters was by attending their parents' funerals. And then busting them. So my father was trying to head that off by buying a plot. So I wanted to be with my parents. I said my father was a Republican and a conservative Republican, but he was also a very intelligent guy who had lived around, lived in China and lived in South America, as an imperialist, by the way. But when I turned my draft card in, I told him I was going to do it, and his response to me was, well, Bruce, we raised you to think for yourself. So if this is what you want to do, I'll support you. And he did support me. So that was a reason I wanted to come back, was to be with them. And the other reason was because I wanted to meet my wife and have a beautiful 26-year-old daughter.
That was my second question. You know, how did your wife feel, being like, hey, I have to go back and go to jail?
Well, I didn't meet my wife until I came back to the States.
Oh, I think
the
so.
other woman I was married to and I had split up by that time.
Oh, okay.
She was a Canadian citizen, which was why I was able to immigrate from Sweden to Canada. She later came out as gay. She lives on the West Coast in Seattle.
Great place.
Yeah, great place. She's a tattoo artist, interesting woman. She goes by the name of Lamar Van Dyke. Anybody else? Sure.
So I noticed that you said earlier you used fake passports like into certain countries. I mean, why did you do that?
When I left the States in 1970, I didn't have travel documents. So in order for me to travel from Canada to Sweden, I needed a passport. So what I did was, I went to the library, and because I wanted to keep my story simple, I looked under birth dates of August 21st, which is the day I was born. Found a person that was born in Canada on August 21st, 1948. Knew that only 1 in every 8 Canadian young men at that time had a passport. So I made an application under his name, which was Stephen Bradnam. And the application process was fairly easy. I went to the library, got a library card, I got a social insurance card, Canadian system, and I got a Canadian driver's license under his name, and I got his birth certificate. So with those 4 documents, I was able to make application. It's much tighter now, believe me.
Yeah, I was like,
I was able to make application for a Canadian citizen, or for a Canadian passport, and it was granted to me. And the only kick was that I needed somebody to sign a document that said they had known me for at least 5 years. And in Canada in those days, there were progressive church people who were willing to do that, who risked their professional livelihood to do things like that. I met a Episcopalian minister who said, sure, I'll sign that for you. And he signed, I'd known this guy for 5 years. And with that, I made an application for the passport. And within, I think it took not more than 3 or 4 weeks, there it was, an official Canadian passport with an official Canadian stamp on it. And my agreement with the minister was, as soon as I got to Sweden, I would destroy the document, which is what I did.
Okay.
Different times though, you know, people, I was trying to say to the class the other day that you could have a professor that would give you, when you were in college, would give you C or better, even if you were male and you were of draft age. So there were certain professors, like when I got to college, though I didn't need when people would say, you know, doctor, this, and this would give you a C or better, so you would prevent you from being drafted. There were those kinds of things happening. I mean, it was kind of like under the radar, but somebody would tell you in your dorm, hey, guess what? If you take Andrews instead of Smith, you can get a C or better no matter what you do in the class. So you can stop from being drafted before.
Right, because if you failed out of college, you were reclassified from a student deferment, they called it, to 1A, which meant you were eligible for the draft.
And as it got further on, after Nixon's election in 1968, 69, whatever, then they came up with a lotto system with the numbers, and it was even worse. As I said to you, my professor was drafted right out of college. My professor was drafted out of my American Lit class. So I don't know what happened to him, but I'm saying, so that people were really doing things like Bruce is saying. There were people who you could trust in certain religious groups. Unitarian Church was one. I think you did a talk at that Unitarian Church in Rochester.
Yes.
that was a church you could go to get help. So people there would say, yeah, we can talk to you about this. If you didn't know what to do, in other words, Ryan decides in a current situation, or Owen or somebody wants some counseling, they would give you the counseling and say, this is what you might do before you end up like you were really alone. I mean, that's I don't know, how did you survive in Sweden? That would be my question. How did you survive? Like, what did you do for work?
Well, the Swedish government, first of all, I should say the Swedish people opposed the war in Vietnam. I would say 95% of the people of Sweden, to the extent that the North Vietnamese and the NLF and the PRG had an information office in downtown Stockholm that was open and running and functioning, and 2 blocks from the American Embassy. The Swedish people supported the Vietnamese people because they supported it because it was a national war of liberation. It was an attempt by the Swedish people, or by the Vietnamese people, to overthrow both French and American domination of their country, which had been going on prior to the French for centuries by resisting China's invasion into Vietnam. So on Saturday mornings in downtown Stockholm, young people would be out with a can, shaking cans, collecting money for the National Liberation Front. And they raised millions of krona, which was handed over to the Vietnamese people and used to fight the Americans. So I was in a country where I was surrounded by some friends, the Swedish people. And they made a decision, the Swedish government and the Swedish people, to offer sanctuary, humanitarian asylum, to American war resistors. And they lived up to it. So I was given money for housing, I was put in a language school, I was trained to speak Swedish, although I don't remember much anymore.
Oh, what's it feel like to you speak
Yeah.
Swedish?
But enough that at that point I could function in Swedish. A rent subsidy. And for the first 6 months it was tough, but the government supported me. And the thing was that everywhere, anybody who was born in Sweden after the end of the Second World War spoke English, interestingly enough. Prior to that, Swedes spoke as a second language German. But at the end of the Second World War, they English. And that's true throughout Scandinavia. It's also true in Denmark and Norway, Finland. Finland was more Russian dominated than the other Scandinavian countries. Medical costs are free in Sweden. You know, it's national health insurance is come on, it just makes sense. Anything short of national health insurance is absurd. But we're talking 50 years ago that it made sense in Sweden. It's not a new idea. So my dental care was taken care of, my health care was taken care of. Swedish government went out of their way to assist me, and I worked. I got a job through the World Council of Churches, and my job working for the World Council of Churches was to assist newly arriving American war resistors coming to Sweden. I was there in 72, or 1970, and started working for the Council of Churches then, and it didn't start tapering down, the numbers coming there, until around 1972. So for 2 years I worked for the Council of Churches, and at that point I got married, bailed, and went to Canada. And once I got to Canada, finding work was easy, although I did find out through Freedom of Information Act requests that every time I applied for a job in Canada, the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, reported that I was working at such and such a place to the FBI, because the FBI still had outstanding warrants for my arrest. But that didn't prevent, in Canada it didn't prevent, in fact they actually, in some cases, assisted me in finding employment, the fact that I was a Vietnam-era draft resistant. Yeah.
When you got to Sweden,
You don't need to raise your hand, just shoot.
Okay. When you got to Sweden, how did you, find that connection? I mean, so you weren't just like at the airport, like, hey,
Right.
you.
Well, when I got to the airport, I had this false passport. So I go through customs, and now I'm out on the street waiting for a cab to take me from our house airport into downtown Stockholm. I go into downtown Stockholm, which is a gorgeous city if I've ever been there. I recommend it. It's expensive, but it's beautiful. I'm standing in this square in downtown Stockholm going, well, now what do I do? And just completely by chance, I happened to run into, as I said to you, young people spoke English. So I went up to a guy, and I knew there was an organization called the American Deserters Committee in downtown Stockholm. I didn't know where it was. And I said, I'm a newly arrived in your country, and do you know anything about the American Deserters Committee? And he gets this big smile on his face. He said, oh, I'm a deserter. I'll take you there. So he kind of looked like he was an American. Long hair, scruffy, hippie guy, yeah. So he takes me to the ADC, American Deserters Committee, and I was assisted in the process of finding a place to live, and with the help of the ADC. And the ADC was sort of the political arm of deserters living in Sweden. Most of the guys who went to Sweden were deserters, not so many draft resistors. There are a number of very interesting cases. One was 4 guys called the Intrepid 4 who had been were in the Navy and had been aboard the naval aircraft carrier, the Intrepid, which is, I think,
It's a museum now.
4 guys on board that boat were called monkey wrenchers. And the reason they were called monkey wrenchers was because they left their monkey wrenches in the engine housing of the jet aircraft. So when the engine fired up, the monkey wrench was sucked into the jet engine and it exploded.
They quite literally threw a monkey wrench into it.
Exactly. They jumped ship in Japan, went to the Soviet Union with the help of the Japanese underground called Brennan, and I don't know, I can't translate it for you. They got to the Soviet Union. They were sent from Moscow down to Georgia, where they lived for 6 months while the Russian government negotiated with the Swedish government, because the Russians knew that if they outed these guys in public, the association between, at that time, Cold War Russia and deserters would have just, these cowards, these traitors, these whatever, would have just blown the whole thing out of proportion. So they lived in the Soviet Union in Georgia, where Stalin was from, and then got transferred up into Sweden, where the Swedish government welcomed them. And they were the first to arrive. They had a very interesting time in Georgia. I got to know them quite well. They were friends of mine. They were stuck out in this stuga, cottage, and given all the vodka they wanted, but told not to be public, and told to stay there. So it was tough. They drank a lot. It wasn't an easy process for them. Remember, they're coming out of combat situations. So many of the veterans I knew in Canada had come, deserters now, had come out from combat situations and were home on leave and were facing going back when they deserted and went to Canada. But most of the people that went to Canada were the draft dodgers, the draft resistors. I shouldn't call them draft dodgers because Donald Trump's a draft dodger, Steve Bannon's a draft dodger. Neither of them served in Vietnam, although if you listen to Steve Bannon's speech yesterday, he's going on about Vietnam. Go back and look at it from CNN. It's really a curious document. Here he is lambasting, I can't remember which senator for not being a member of the armed forces, and yet his best buddy, Donald Trump, gets out with bone spurs, which was a phony-ass deferment. a lot of guys got out with phony deferments. If your father was wealthy, you could literally buy a deferment by going to a psychologist and saying he's gay, he's this, he's that, and you'd literally get a deferment and avoid service. Jerry's absolutely right. You know, most of the people who fought on the front lines, or many of the people who fought on the front lines of Vietnam, were black and white, working class, Hispanic, Latino. Those were the ones they put out into the front. Working class white guys. If you had a college education, probably had a first lieutenant, which in itself was a little dicey. Because sometimes you tell your people to do things and they wouldn't do it, and you might end up dead. There were a number of first lieutenants who were killed by their men, called fragging. Not much attention's been paid to it. It did happen, and it happened at a higher rate than most people know. The anti-war GI resistance movement is the movement coupled with, I believe, Vietnam-era draft resistors and deserters that stopped the war. You know, when GIs start saying, no, I ain't gonna fight, when GIs start going to jail and say, no, we aren't going, we aren't gonna comply with your orders, that kind of, again, using the term, it kind of throws a wrench into the whole thing. I mean, imagine, and I can remember pictures in the stockades of 50, 60 guys out in, on the West Coast in, what was that, the Presidio case. 50, 60 men in the Presidio prison who refused to board ships and go to Vietnam. Many of them were black. African-American soldiers took a lead and Hispanic soldiers, Brown Berets, took a lead in GI resistance. Anyway, I think that's the end of that thought.
Okay, we gotta go. We gotta go anyway. If there's any other questions, we got another talk though at 4 o'clock, so collaborate.
I appreciate you guys listening to me. Keep these things in mind as you face the future. We need people in the streets, and it isn't, you know, Me Too, Black Lives Matter. The anti-war movement seems to be missing from the streets right now, but we need to. We just can't let this go on any longer. You know, resistance is as American as apple pie. You know, we resisted the British. We got to be able to resist this kook.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys very much.